welcome to the 2-month review. Welcome to actually what is the first episode of the second season, so to speak, of the 2-month review, in which we're going to be talking about Tómas Jónsson bestseller by Guðbergur Bergsson over the next, I think it's going to be 11 episodes. It's a long time. It's just over 2 months, so in the next 2 months. As always, this is Chad Post from Open Letter Books. I'm here with Brian Wood.
Howdy, guys.
And who you know from the past season in which we talked about The Invented Part by Rodrigo Frazan. And this time...
Also known as the best season. the one and only season. And the best season.
Not the first season. I think the first season was, in fact, my favorite season.
Yes, I agree.
and the other voice you hear is Lytton Smith, who was on here on the very first episode. He is the translator of Tómas Jónsson bestseller and several other Icelandic books, which we'll talk about later. He's also a poet. He is a professor at SUNY Geneseo here just outside of Rochester, and a really great person, MFA from Columbia, also has done a ton of other things in helping promote international literature and literature as a whole. So welcome, Lytton.
I think we have to begin by pointing out that we've been accused of sort of like fake news and alternative facts because this book is called Tómas Jónsson bestseller. And so I think before anything can happen, we need like everybody to go out and buy the book and make it a bestseller. Otherwise, like the whole truth of this is going to be really, really skewed.
Don't let Steve Bannon win.
Right, exactly. Buy Tómas Jónsson bestseller. Otherwise, Steve Bannon wins. Something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it was a bestseller in Iceland, no?
I mean, yes. I mean, it went into 3 editions. So but it's this hugely influential book. It's sort of seen in some ways as the breakthrough modernist book, and it's really interesting, like Icelandic modernism. So this book's published in 1966 in Iceland, and that's sort of the hallmark of Icelandic modernism. Whereas, to the extent that we think about modernism in America and Europe, that's normally sort of seen as like the early 20th century. So sort of really interesting sort of cultural and historical difference there. But it's a sort of book that everybody is meant to have a copy of in their house, even if they haven't yet got round to reading it.
So it probably was about. How many copies do you think it takes to be a bestseller in Iceland?
11.
I mean, these days a few thousand, I think, is considered to be a really big sell. I mean, there's about 300,000 people in Iceland, but I think the figure is something like 80% of them are readers in the sense of sort of regularly reading, which is an astonishing number compared to the UK.
I've seen that it's been compared to like Ulysses in some way. So is it like Ulysses in that a lot of people have it on their bookshelves but don't read it? Like you were saying, like
I mean, I think there is some of that.
It's one of the greatest books ever. You read it? Oh God, no, I haven't read Ulysses. Look at that thing.
I just look for the dirty masturbation parts, to be honest.
And there are some dirty masturbation parts in this book, it must be said. So,
get ready for some good penis talk on this season.
Yes. Be like, but I think I've had conversations with Icelandic writers who shall go unnamed, who will, after a few Brennivins, admit to not actually having read it, despite being incredibly well-read Icelandic writers. And so there is that sense to it, but it's also a book like Ulysses where, and I think this is what makes it perfect for the 2-month review, is that it rewards a kind of slower reading and sort of stopping and sort of finding out more information, the way that like maybe the best way to read Ulysses is with the aid of a companion or compendium or with other people.
Yeah, I agree. That's kind of what inspired the 2-month review to begin with, was the idea that these books that have been canonized, like Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake or even Gravity's Rainbow, maybe David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest to a lesser extent, generally have some sort of companions that exist in the world. That someone's done enough research, written their dissertation, put together a sort of guide, or at least enough of a guide to help you through the moments where you're like, I have no idea what's happening here. And when you're doing a new book or bringing a book into English for the first time like this, that has been around for 50 years but like has never been read by an American, that even within those 50 years in Iceland there might be some sort of compendium, but we don't have access to that this would be a way to start to create that framework so that readers can look at this and say, wow, this is really funny and wild and interesting, but I'm not sure what's going on. But this thing right here, this series of posts, this podcast is giving me opening up the doors, helping put this into context and helping frame it. So like that was always my inspiration for this in the first place, was to create that sort of, be that companion, be a living companion to reading this book.
Yeah, and I'm super excited about it. I mean, I've obviously spent, I've read this book so many times over the past couple of years while I've been translating it, both in the original and sort of going, through my own translation. And you can really go down a rabbit hole with it. When we get into early September, and we're around about the what's known as the 10th composition book. So this book is actually sort of imagined as a series of notebooks that somebody has found after the death of the narrator, right? So it's sort of narrated by Tómas Jónsson, except he's really just writing these things in the notebooks, and one of his lodgers actually puts it all together. So there's this unreliability. But partway through, there's this sort of story within a story about things that happened with American sailors in Iceland during the Second World War. And the more I got into researching that, I realized that this is based on obscure U.S. military history that maybe people in Iceland know, but maybe they don't. But I don't think people in America know. And so that it's a really rich book for discovering that kind of stuff.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that, and stuff about bodily functions. Very funny, but offset that too, which I think is what's going to make this really enjoyable and entertaining to do and to read as we go through it. I have a question for you, just to back this up a little bit. You are familiar with some of his other books, at least, because Bergsson, do you want to give do you know enough about him to give a quick little rundown of his bio?
Yeah, I mean, so he's a fascinating and somewhat controversial figure in Iceland. I mean, there's for people who follow, who can speak or listen to Icelandic, there's some pretty interesting YouTube videos of things he said at public readings in the last few years. But he was born in the early 30s in a sort of small village called Grindavik, he also ended up studying for a while at the University of Barcelona. And so he has this really interesting profile as the author of 20 books, including poetry and children's literature. He's won the Icelandic Literary Prize twice, but he's also a major translator of Spanish literature. He's translated Don Quixote not once, but twice, which I wonder if anyone in the world has done that, right? He's the only person in the world to translate Don Quixote twice. He's the translator of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And there's this really interesting thing where people have written about how Marquez's work has shaped his own, but he's sort of pointed out that Tómas Jónsson Metsolo book, or Tómas Jónsson bestseller, as it's known in English, actually came out years before Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. So for Bergsson, it's more like he influenced Marquez, even though Marquez, didn't read his book. And there's a really interesting set of controversies there.
I love that. I love the idea of just saying nope. Mine came first. I'm the influence.
Right. Absolutely. And he's got, he's very interested in a lot of his work with themes of nationalism, but in this really global context. And I think that's the other thing, the eeriness of translating this book with the sort of the incoming of the Trump administration is that there's moments where Bestseller is talking about Iceland's leadership role in the world. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of ironic in the sense that, Iceland doesn't have one, but also Iceland does. And it's been the site of some really important political meetings, right?
Yeah.
And US history, has that in it. And it's this really important point in sort of the Cold War. But then thinking about sort of America's leadership role in the world, or whether it has one right now.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So of his books too, the only one other one has been translated in English. It's The Swan, which came out in 1991 in Iceland. I believe The Swan was translated by a relatively small press. Mare's Nest is the name of it, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. That mostly sells their books in Iceland, I believe, in English. I remember seeing it and reading part of it years and years ago, which is maybe the second time I came across Bergson's name. But in my mind, it was incredibly different from this. It was much more lyrical and direct. I mean, am I misremembering that, or is that
No, you're not misremembering it. I mean, the overall story, it's kind of difficult to summarize the story of Bestseller, mm-hmm. Because it's partly about the sort of the style of it. But the story of The Swan, which is translated by Bernard Scudder, incredibly important Icelandic translator. It's much more simple in the sense of this 9-year-old girl who's been stealing sandwiches from shops and gets sent to the countryside as punishment, right? And so it's this meditation on sort of like rural life and sort of ideas of like punishment and things like that. But what's interesting about The Swan is it's known as a magical realist novel of sorts,
right?
And that's where the Guðbergur Garcia Marquez is. So there's a kind of like companion piece quality to The Swan and Bestseller, but Bestseller, you've got this retired, cranky, senile, possibly blind bank clerk who's really just upset with his life and is like living in his own basement and renting out rooms, and he's just pissed that there are kids all over his place and they're not his kids, they're his lodger's kids, and he's got all these like sexual appetites for this the women who he's renting to, but he's also kind of disgusted at himself for that and disgusted by sex, and just real fascinating misanthropic character who he's kind of a satire on Icelandic masculinity.
Right.
Sounds like the autobiography I'm working on. So this is kind of interesting. So it's this huge, massive book in Iceland. How did you get connected with it as far as translating it?
Well, it's a book that, Chad will tell part of the story, I think, but Chad was kind enough and Open Letter were kind enough to come to me and see if I would be interested in doing it. And it's a book that I had known about, never sort of quite imagined I'd get to be the one to translate. Its influence in Icelandic literature is almost impossible to overstate. Even people who didn't sort of get directly influenced by it, the way that they can write now has been forever changed by the way that it broke formal ground and sort of changed some of the themes of Iceland.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this was something that was on your radar, Chad, for a while, and you're just looking for a way of when could we get this out or translated?
Yeah. So the first time I heard of him was, do you remember McSweeney's used to be printed in Iceland back when it was relatively new magazine? And in honor of that, they did one issue in the early 2000s that was all Icelandic writers. And there was a bit, I don't think it was from this book, this is the part I don't remember. It was from one of his books that was included in there, and it was pretty awesome. And I remember thinking at that point in time, it'd be cool to find out more about this writer and more about like what books of his we should do. And it just became overwhelming. At that point in time, wasn't in touch with any Icelandic translator or anything like that. So it just died. That's when I read The Swan or found it and read part of it. I was like, well, this is fine, but like, that's so different from Tómas Jónsson. And Tómas Jónsson is so much more in my sort of wheelhouse of interest. But when I was in Iceland a couple of times, in the bookstores, he has 1 billion books. And when I was there with Sylvie, and I think with Bragi as well, Olafsson and Sigurdsson have reversed those, but Sylvie Sigurdsson and Bragi Olafsson, we were in the bookstore and there's a ton of Bergsson books. And I was like, is he someone we should be looking at? And they're like, oh yeah, definitely. Tómas Jónsson is like our Ulysses. We all have it. We might not have read it. It's there. It's the book. Everyone knows this book. It is the book. And it's like, okay, that sounds really cool. And so I started asking people like Kari, who will be on here later this season, and you, Lytton, and other people, like, is this something we should do? And everyone's like, yeah, no, it's really important. It's a great book. And so we got the rights, we got it all figured out. And in fact, like the person at the publishing house, the rights director that sold the rights to us, like almost cried when she found out that the book had been printed and she was able to actually hold it and see it in English. That it had been like a dream of hers that this book would get out into the world because it is so important to a certain type of reader in Iceland, and that it shows Iceland in a way that it's never been represented in literature before. I mean, we have Laxness, we have these other writers, but this is different than that.
Wow. Okay.
I think one of the exciting things about what this book allows us to talk about is particularly with the sort of the tourist bubble around Iceland. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of romanticizing about how great Iceland is, and it is great, right? Don't get me wrong. I mean, I love going there. I love the things that are happening there, but there are definitely problems under the surface, and people are maybe just not aware of them because it's easy to look at the country and say, wow, they've got sort of this renewable energy and they're sort of self-sufficient and everything seems great. And they have a really great track record on feminism and things like that. But it's
just Bjork and glaciers, right?
Right. That's it. Like every time you turn around, Bjork's on a glacier.
Puffin. Lots of puffin.
Lots of puffin.
Sweet, delicious puffin meat.
Maybe we should have in one of these episodes somebody eating a puffin live.
I've been drinking Black Death the whole time, in case you guys didn't realize that. But.
I was beginning to think your words are slurring more and more as we go on, so that would explain it. But,
there will be a Brenneman party in the midst of this.
No, but it's not willful. But like, I'm extremely ignorant for Iceland outside of the few touchstones that are like renewable energy, or they've got all the geothermal going on. You fly over it on the way to Europe, but like for the most part, you don't hear or know much about Iceland, especially not their literature and whatnot. So.
Yeah, and the people may know, like one of the Icelandic writers that people do know is Sjón, and who's been selling a lot of copies of books in translation over here, and he's a massive fan of Guðbergur Bergsson, and sort of he keeps coming back to his books, but precisely because he sees them as attacks on like overblown ideas of what Iceland is and Icelandic nationalism. And I think it's really good to have a book that's not actually complimentary about Iceland available to readers.
Yeah, I can agree with that, and that's why Sjón blurbed this and like included in his in an interview that he did recently for his latest book a lot of comments about Tómas Jónsson and Bergsson being his big influence on his work. So that totally makes sense. And Sjón probably is at this moment the biggest literary figure from Iceland that Americans will recognize.
Yeah, I'd say so for sure.
And then Björk, and then Sigur Rós, and then. And then we go down that hole. But so which other books of Bergson's have you read? And you mentioned one the other night, but I mean, he's been writing. He wrote the first book in 1961, then Tómas Jónsson in 1966, but he had a book come out in 2014. Like that's a 53-year span of writing. That's fucking insane to think about. Like he's published books longer than I've been alive.
Yeah, no, he's just he's. Incredibly prolific. And I mean, the one that I'm really interested in is a book that came out in 2012 called Hin Eilifte Frau. And it's sort of, this really, I mean, obviously it's not been translated into English yet, although it'd be a really interesting follow-up to this book. But again, it means translates as the eternal desire. And it's this really interesting book where there's this sort of Icelandic rain site in the middle of an industrial wasteland, and it's all about consumerism and what you can sell to people and how that corrupts people. Wow. And reviewers in Iceland have described it as this really sort of like cold and miserable and difficult book that is, then that's a good thing, right? Those aren't criticisms, because it's not meant to comfort you, it's meant to really jar you, and I definitely got into that. So that's sort of his wheelhouse, right? It is these things which stop you in your tracks and take anything you have that might be idealized and point out the problems with that.
Cold and miserable. That sounds like Chad's autobiography.
Very true. Actually, that was my log line for this to pitch to their sales force for consortium, was that this was the book of Chad being old and lying in bed screaming at things. They're like, oh, I get it.
Of Tómas Jónsson.
Yeah, they're like, I totally get this book now.
Right.
But I'm really interested in this idea of calling it Icelandic modernism and it taking place in the 60s, because we just came off of Rodrigo Frazon's The Invented Part, which was really neat because it talked about, which would be American modernism with Fitzgerald, right? With and then kind of it's placed next to what I would consider his work being a little more postmodern. And it's this interesting conversation and like between the two. So I wonder if you could speak just a little bit more about this modernism taking place in the 60s. That seems kind of oxymoronic and interesting to me.
Yeah, and it is, I think, compared to a lot of other Northern European countries, it is late, but it probably needs situated in the context of the fact that Iceland doesn't get independence. It wins its independence from Denmark in 1944. And so, the sort of modernism of the 60s is really not necessarily born at that moment, but it's certainly shaped by that moment and maybe not made possible until that independence happens, right?
Okay.
But I think it also speaks to, I think modernism is this thing about like how much is the individual kind of free to follow his or her own desires, and what does that freedom mean? And I think that's something that Icelanders were really beginning to think about after the sort of the building of the American military base at Keflavik, and the question of, well, did that make them more or less Icelandic, and did they have to rely on other people?
Right. So that's pretty interesting. How does this relate to Laxness's independent people?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because there's as people read through Tómas Jónsson bestseller, Laxness comes in for a bit of a kicking at various times, and there is this friction. Fans of Guðbergur Bergsson often think of him as the person who should have won the Nobel Prize, right?
Yeah.
But one way to think about it is that there's potentially, a couple of versions of Laxness, and then maybe, Bergsson is sort of happier with some of the more critical books of Laxness's. But independent people, I mean, it came out in 34 and 35 in Iceland, so it comes out around the time Guðbergur Bergsson's being born.
Right.
And I think the thing is that, and that is right, it's an anti-materialist book. It's not a fan of capitalism. And so they're definitely working in the same direction. But I think Bergsson felt that Laxness was still somewhat perpetuating a myth of sort of the noble Icelandic rural. Even though, Laxness, he's critiquing that too, but Bergsson, especially at this moment in the 60s, is no fan of Laxness, I think it's fair to say.
Right, which is the sense I had. I've read some Laxness. I've been actually listening to the audiobook of Independent People in preparation for this, and it's fine.
Right.
And I'm not a huge fan. But
that'd be an awesome blurb for the front of the book. It's fine.
It's fine. It's not as bad. It sometimes gets a little bit long in the sheep talk.
Right.
It's slow. But there is that drive of like, I'm going to be an independent person. Like the whole first part of it, part one is the part that I just finished. I mean, I'm not far into it, but that whole idea of, is it Bjartar? However you say his name, is like that he's going to be free from like paying for his land. He's going to have his own independent way of doing things. And it is some of those seeds of nationalism right there. And even when the politics come in relation to Denmark at that time, it is clear that there's like this urge for like the Icelandic people are great people. We need to like and he has that torn between the materialism of like taking care of his sheep and everyone's belief in like their kind of fairies and like and rituals and that kind of stuff, and where the spirit is in Iceland. So it does make sense that this is kind of a reaction to that, or is in conversation with that book a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think maybe one of the ways in which Bestseller is kind of a response to that is that while it agrees with independent people that self-reliance isn't actually such a good thing, it also disagrees with independent people, and independent people is, it's pretty coherent. It's sort of modeled on the sort of the classic 19th century European novel. It might even recall something like Crime and Punishment in certain ways, whereas Bestseller is much more fragmented. As we said, it sort of owes a debt to things like magical realism or to the modernism of James Joyce, or David Smith, who's going to be on the podcast in a few weeks' time, was comparing it to the novels of Beckett, which I think is a really smart comparison.
Oh, wow.
And so that sense of things not quite coming together, not quite cohering into a whole, without going down the academic wormhole, that's maybe more sort of like postmodernist, right? This sort of sense of the world falling apart. I think maybe for some readers, people who've maybe read things like Infinite Jest or something like that, some of Thomas Pynchon would find themselves really at home in Bestseller.
Yeah,
which we have a lot of white male listeners, so they definitely would have read David Foster Wallace. I have a question about translating this. So it seems like, aside from the actual gravity of like, holy crap, this is a really important piece of work, don't screw it up. Like, was there a specific challenge in translating something that's fragmented and kind of interweaving narratives? Did you find any specific challenges with this book in particular?
Oh God, the man doesn't use periods. I mean, it's like there's this stream of words on the page, and you're like, where does this begin and end? Like, I mean, even on that fundamental level of suddenly you're thinking, I'm sort of in the role of being an editor, and that there are times when I have to decide whether something goes with what comes before it or what comes after it. And it's meant to be this thing where, you can actually put one phrase as part of one sentence and one phrase and the same phrase as part of another sentence and change meaning about and stuff. But that was a major headache to begin with. And then there were moments where, like I would be just stumped by something, and I would sort of speak to, I got some help from Magnus Sigurðsson, who's a fantastic Icelandic poet and a guy who's translated Ezra Pound into Icelandic, right? So he's not scared of a difficult writer.
I could have sworn that was one of those strongmen.
He also is, right? And,
that sounds like a name of a guy that got gold medal in the strongman in 1987.
Anybody called Magnus is, but there were moments when Magnus would while lifting, a truck up with one hand, he would say to me that, he's like, I'm not sure what the Icelandic means here, right? Like that's a sort of an articulate, literate, well-read Icelandic reader saying,
oh, man.
The Icelandic tests comprehension for Icelanders, and that's fine, right? You gain from that kind of thinking.
Well, it sounds absolutely incredible, and I'm really interested in this one because it sounds like it's a super important book, and I really like that it illustrates and illuminates like a huge gap and dark spot in my knowledge of the literary world. So I can't wait to pick it up and have that, a light shine on there. But are we doing the same thing where you can get it at a discount through the website? Or
yeah, you absolutely can get it at a discount through the website. You just use at the checkout, there's a place for a code, and you put in the number 2 followed by month, all as one word, no spaces, and you'll get 20% off. It's also for sale at a bunch of all great independent bookstores. Anywhere that you usually shop for should have it. In fact, we do have a number of booksellers that are going to be on this season, including one from Asheville who has not appeared here before, Jacob Rogers, who's a translator from the Galician. So it's going to be fun. There's people there are a lot of booksellers that are into it. It's going to be interesting to talk to them. I have to tell you guys too, my favorite thing about this book is that unlike with Rodrigo's book, where sometimes we'd hit like a moment where we're like, oh, did we actually like lay that out wrong? Like, do you remember there's a section where it's like, I don't know if there's supposed to be a paragraph there or not, and we just sort of went by it. With this one, doesn't matter. Like, if we made 42 mistakes, you'll never know. You'll absolutely never be able to tell. So I like that. Yep. I like books that have a large range for minor mistakes. Lots of give. Those error bars are wide.
Yeah, no. Although I found myself getting like poor Kaya when she was like sort of going through the edits with me and giving me all these great edits. I was also being really particular at some places about like, no, that needs to be like indented 1 or 2 more times just because that was the way it was in the Icelandic book. And I was like, I'm not changing a damn thing about this book because I don't want to break it.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And I totally agree with that. But that's the thing, like people reading this thing be like, is that really supposed to be one? Why is this paragraph not indented and the other ones are? It's just like, because that's how it is.
Right.
Period.
Right.
Well, if nothing else, I'm gonna pick it up and read it and follow along, just so at a cocktail party I can name drop this.
Hell yeah!
And nobody else has actually read it. Be like, oh, you haven't read Bestseller? Oh my god! This is like the most important book in all of Iceland. What's wrong with you? Jeez. Just for that, I'm doing it, and that's gonna be so. I'm gleefully waiting to be able to name drop this and just. Boom! Right on top of someone's head.
So
just for that,
which is perfect, and just to sort of wrap things up here and give everyone like the last bit of housekeeping. The next episode of this will air actually on August 17th, and they'll be covering the first 31 pages of the book, which is the biography, first composition book, second book, third composition book, and you'll notice that all those are written differently. There's no consistency between like the numbering of the chapters in here. Let me read you the biography real quick so you guys have a sense of this. So biography, I'm descended from the bravest blue-eyed Vikings. I'm related to courtly poets and victorious kings. I'm an Icelander. My name is Tómas Jónsson. I am old. No. That's the end of the biography. So there you go. Get the book. There's on Goodreads, there is a group under 2-month review. If you do a search for that in the groups, there'll be a thread there for talking about Tómas Jónsson. Aside from that, you can follow 3%, our blog for weekly posts about this, and the full reading schedule will be available there. I don't want to read it off because it'd be ridiculous, but it'll be listed there as its own post, and it'll be on the Goodreads site. You can always follow us on Twitter is at @open_letter, and I'm at Chad W Post. Lytton, are you on Twitter, or are you not a Twitter person?
Yeah, I'm at Lytton J Smith.
Oh, okay, perfect. I'll have links to that too on the post for this. And Brian is always at Brian_Wood. No, Brian Wood _.
Yeah, that's the one. Brian Wood's a really popular name, so yeah.
As we found out, because wood means crazy.
It does, yeah.
So there's a lot of those people on the Twitter.
Oh
yeah. But very cool. So we'll be back next week with the first part, and I guess we'll go from there.